Your pension is only $1,000 a month. You won't survive, my daughter said, laughing in my face. Her husband added, You have two options. Clean up after us and live in the house, or go begging. They thought they had me cornered, but they didn't know that I owned 6 houses in the city, had $10 million in a trust, and had already made a plan that would wipe their smug smiles off their faces forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. I slid the ribeye steaks onto the good plates, the ones with the blue trim that hadn't seen use in probably 2 years. The meat had cost me $40 at the butcher. A stupid extravagance, but tonight warranted it. The roasted vegetables glistened with olive oil and herbs. I'd opened the Pinot Noir an hour early to let it breathe, something I'd read about in a magazine once. The dining room table looked almost elegant with the cloth napkins folded beside each plate, 2 candles flickering between the wine glasses. 35 years. That's how long I'd run Peterson and Associates, waking at 6 every morning, balancing ledgers for small businesses and families who trusted me with their numbers. Last Friday, I'd locked the office door for the final time, deposited the key with the property manager, and driven home with my chest feeling lighter than it had in decades. Dinner's ready, I called down the hallway. Thelma appeared first, still in her work clothes, pulling her hair from its ponytail. Elmer followed, thumbs moving across his phone screen. They settled into their usual chairs without comment on the table settings or the smell of expensive meat. I carried the wine bottle to the table and filled their glasses, then mine. My hand trembled slightly, not from age, from anticipation. I'd rehearsed this moment for weeks. I wanted tonight to be special, I said, remaining standing. I've got news, big news. As of last Friday, I officially closed Peterson and Associates. 35 years, and I'm finally done. Thelma's eyebrows lifted. You retired? Just like that? Just like that? I raised my glass. To new beginnings. Wait, what about your pension? She leaned forward, fork poised over her steak. I mean, accounting firm owner. That must come with a solid retirement package, right? The question seemed reasonable. I lowered my glass, nodding. Well, I'll get Social Security. About $1,200 a month. It's enough for my needs. I've never been extravagant. The words hung there for 3, maybe 4 seconds. Then Thelma's face changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift around her eyes and mouth. A small sound escaped her throat. Not quite a laugh, but close. Elmer looked up from his plate. 1,200? Monthly? That's right. Now Thelma did laugh, a sharp bark that made me flinch. Her hand flew to her mouth, but her eyes stayed cold, calculating. 1,200? Dad, my car payment is more than that. How do you expect to live on $1,200? I set my glass down carefully. The stem felt fragile between my fingers. I've always lived within my means. I don't need much. Guess you should have thought about that before shutting down your income source. Elmer cut into his steak, the knife scraping against porcelain. Most people plan for retirement. They don't just stop. Heat crept up my neck. I have planned. I've been careful with money my entire life. My expenses are low. I own my car outright. I don't... This is actually serious, Dad. Thelma's voice shifted, the laughter gone, replaced by something worse, pity mixed with annoyance. You can't survive on that. What about medical expenses, utilities, food, basic necessities? I manage fine. You manage because you live here. Elmer leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. Because we don't charge you rent. Don't make you split bills. On your own? 1,200 wouldn't cover a studio apartment in this city? The candles wavered. My steak sat untouched, cooling, the expensive meat I'd bought to celebrate congealing into gray fat. Across the table, they exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication married couples develop, a whole conversation in a single look. When Thelma turned back to me, her expression had hardened. How long have you known about this? The Social Security amount? I've known for a while, since I started planning to close the business. And it never occurred to you that this might be a problem? Her voice rose slightly. That $1,200 a month is poverty-level income? That you might have made a mistake? My fingers tightened around my wine glass. The celebration I'd imagined, the pride, the acknowledgement of a career completed, the transition into a quieter life, dissolved like sugar in water. These weren't the faces of people happy for me. These were the faces of people suddenly worried about their own situation. "Face it, old man." Elmer pushed his plate away, the screech of porcelain against wood loud in the silent room. "You're not in a position to be celebrating right now. You're in a position to be worried." I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. The dining room felt smaller, the air thicker. Thelma had already returned to her meal, cutting her steak with efficient, angry movements. Elmer pulled out his phone again, scrolling, done with the conversation. My hand found the edge of the table. The wood felt solid under my palm, grounding me while everything else tilted sideways. I'd bought this ribeye with money from my last client payment. I'd folded these napkins with care. I'd lit these candles thinking tonight would mark something meaningful. Instead, I sat perfectly still while my daughter and son-in-law finished their expensive steaks, and the celebration I'd planned turned to ash in my mouth. Elmer refilled his wine glass, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't offer to refill mine. The bottle returned to his side of the table with a soft thunk. "Look, Grover, let's be practical here." He swirled the wine, watching it catch the candlelight. "You've got a problem, and we've got a solution. You can stay in this house. Your room's here, you're comfortable. But things need to change." I found my voice. "Change? What are you talking about?" "You need to contribute." He sipped the wine slowly, deliberately. "You're living here rent-free, eating our food. If you're not bringing in real income, you need to earn your place another way. Cooking, cleaning, yard work. Think of it as an exchange." The words didn't process immediately. They entered my ears as sounds without meaning, syllables that couldn't possibly assemble into what I thought I'd heard. "Earn my place?" "Exactly." Elmer nodded as if I'd understood perfectly. "We're not running a charity here. The mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, that all costs money. You want to continue living under this roof? You make yourself useful." "Elmer, I paid half the down payment on this house." My voice came out stronger than I expected. $75,000. 12 years ago, when you two couldn't qualify for the mortgage alone, I wrote that check. I have a stake in this house. I'm not some... That was a gift, Dad. Thelma set her fork down with a sharp click. "A gift. You said you wanted to help us start our lives together. You can't retroactively turn a gift into a loan just because you're having money problems now." "I'm not turning anything into..." I stopped, my throat tight. "I'm saying I've contributed. Significantly. I'm not some charity case you picked up off the street." She leaned forward, and her voice took on that patient tone people use with children or the confused elderly. "Whether you contributed once, 12 years ago, doesn't change your situation now. The mortgage is in our name. The bills are in our name. And frankly, at this point, you're a dependent." The word hung between us like smoke. "A dependent," I repeated. "If you want to stay," Elmer continued as if I hadn't spoken, "you'll need to make yourself useful. Breakfast and dinner on the table. Bathrooms cleaned weekly. Trash out on Tuesdays. Lawn mowed. Gutters cleared. That kind of thing. Basic household maintenance." He was counting on his fingers, listing chores, assigning me tasks as if I were a teenager earning my allowance. "And if I don't?" Elmer shrugged, the gesture casual, almost bored. "Then you've got decisions to make. There are shelters, senior housing, whatever people in your situation do. I'm sure you'll figure something out." My hands gripped the table edge. The wood grain pressed into my palms, a physical sensation to anchor myself while the room spun. Thelma had shifted closer to Elmer, her shoulder touching his, a united front. Their faces showed no doubt, no guilt, no recognition that they were offering servitude in exchange for shelter. "You're serious? Completely serious?" Elmer finished his wine and stood, picking up his plate. "Think it over tonight. Let us know your decision in the morning. But understand, those are your options. Contribute and stay, or figure out somewhere else to go." He walked past me toward the kitchen, his footsteps confident on the hardwood floor. Thelma gathered her own plate, pausing beside my chair. "We're not trying to be cruel, Dad, but we have to be realistic. We can't support another adult on our income, not without something in return." She touched my shoulder briefly, the gesture meant to soften the blow, then followed her husband. Their voices drifted back from the kitchen, normal conversational tones discussing tomorrow's schedule, what time Elmer needed to leave for work, whether they had milk for breakfast. I sat alone at the dining room table. My steak had gone cold, the fat congealed into white pools around the meat. The candles had burned low, wax dripping onto the tablecloth I'd laid out so carefully. The celebration dinner I'd planned, the announcement I'd rehearsed, the pride I'd felt closing my business, had transformed into something unrecognizable. $75,000, I'd given them $75,000. Not loaned, given. They were right about that. I'd said the words myself. This is to help you start your lives together. I'd signed no papers, demanded no repayment schedule, asked for nothing in return except perhaps some basic gratitude, and now they were offering me the chance to clean their toilets. I stood. The chair scraped against the floor, loud enough that the conversation in the kitchen paused briefly. My legs felt unsteady, but I walked with my back straight down the hallway toward my room. "Don't be so dramatic, Dad," Thelma's voice followed me. "We're trying to help you here. This is exactly your problem. You're too proud to accept reality." I didn't respond. I reached my bedroom door, my hand closing around the knob. Behind me, their voices resumed, punctuated by the clink of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of people who just finished dinner and were cleaning up before settling in for the evening. My hand stayed on the doorknob. Down the hall, Elmer laughed at something. The television clicked on, canned laughter from some sitcom bleeding through the walls. I spent the first hour simply sitting on my bed, listening to the house settle around me. Footsteps overhead, Thelma and Elmer moving through their evening routine, running water, the television's muffled drone. Eventually, silence. When I finally moved, it was with purpose. I opened my filing cabinet, the small 2-drawer unit I'd brought with me 12 years ago when I'd temporarily moved into this room. The metal drawer rolled open with a familiar squeak. Inside, folders arranged by year, by category, by importance. An accountant's instinct never dies. I pulled out the folder marked 2013 House Purchase and carried it to my desk. The wire transfer receipt sat on top, the paper slightly yellowed, but the numbers still crisp. 75,000 house. Transfer date, March 15th, 2013. Memo line, home down payment with love. I remembered that afternoon. Thelma had been 25, married less than a year, desperate to buy before Portland's market priced them out completely. They'd found a place in Southeast, a solid 2-story with decent bones, but their combined income couldn't qualify them for the full mortgage. The bank wanted 30% down, $150,000 on a $500,000 purchase price. She'd called me crying. Not manipulative tears, or at least I didn't think so then. Genuine distress. "Dad, we found our home. Our actual home. But we're 50% short on the down payment, and by the time we save it, someone else will buy it, or the prices will go up again." I'd wired the money the next morning. At the closing, she'd hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "This means everything. You made our dream possible. I'll never forget this." I set the receipt aside and reached for another folder. 2018, Emergency Financial Assistance. Thicker than the house folder. Inside, copies of checks, bank statements, payment confirmations. $23,000 total, spread across 4 months. Elmer had lost his job. Something about downsizing, corporate restructuring, the usual bloodless corporate language for destroying lives. They'd missed 3 car payments. Repossession notices had arrived. Their savings account, according to the bank statements Thelma had showed me in panic, held $347. I'd written checks for both car loans, paid off 2 maxed credit cards they'd been using to cover groceries, given them breathing room to land on their feet. "You're a lifesaver, Dad. Literally. I don't know what we would have done." I pulled out a different folder. 2016, wedding. The invoices made a thick stack. Venue rental, $8,500. Catering, $12,000. Photography, $3,500. Flowers, $2,200. Bar service, $3,500. The total at the bottom of my accounting, written in my own neat hand. $3,000. She'd wanted a perfect day. The Pearl District venue overlooking the Willamette River. 200 guests. An open bar serving top-shelf liquor. A string quartet during the ceremony. I'd paid for all of it because a father only gets to see his daughter married once, or so people kept telling me. At the reception, she'd found me standing near the windows, watching the sunset over the river. She'd been radiant in her dress, slightly drunk, gloriously happy. "This is the most beautiful day of my life, and you made it happen. You're the best father anyone could ask for." My hands slowed as I reached for the last folder. The thin one. The one I'd deliberately buried under the others. 2019-2022, Timothy Medical. I made myself open it. Preschool tuition receipts. He'd gone to that Montessori place on Hawthorne. Medical bills from Dornbecker Children's Hospital. So many medical bills. The leukemia diagnosis had come 2 weeks after his second birthday. The treatments, the hope, the specialists, the experimental procedures I'd helped fund because insurance only covered so much. The funeral home invoice was clipped to the back of the folder. Timothy James Morrison. September 3rd, 2019, November 17th, 2022. 3 years, 2 months, 14 days. For those brief years, caring for Timothy had brought us together. I'd been Grandpa Grove. He'd had my eyes, everyone said, and my careful way of stacking blocks in precise towers. After his death, the gulf had widened. Grief divided rather than united us. Thelma had pulled away, thrown herself into work and spending and filling the void with things instead of feeling. I'd let her. I'd thought time would heal. I'd kept writing checks when she needed them, thinking generosity might rebuild what grief had broken. I closed Timothy's folder gently and set it aside. Then I pulled out my calculator and a legal pad. The math took 20 minutes. Down payment, $75,000. Debt bailout, $23,000. Wedding, $30,000. I added smaller items from other folders, birthday gifts, holiday checks, the $8,000 for new appliances when their refrigerator died, the $12,000 for the fence and patio renovation, the countless smaller loans that were never repaid. The calculator's display climbed steadily. Final total, $217,400. I wrote the number at the bottom of the legal pad and underlined it twice. $217,400. Invested in their lives. Given freely, without contracts or repayment schedules, because that's what family did. That's what fathers did. And tonight, they'd laughed at my Social Security payment, told me to earn my keep by taking out their trash. I stared at that number until my eyes burned. Outside my window, Portland's streetlights cast orange shadows across my small room. The bedroom they'd given me was barely 150 square feet. A single bed, a desk, a filing cabinet, a narrow closet. The kind of room you'd give a guest you didn't expect to stay long. I'd been here 12 years. I stood and walked to the window. My reflection stared back, a 63-year-old man in a small room, surrounded by proof of his generosity and evidence of its complete waste. The city lights stretched beyond the glass, beyond this house, beyond their limited understanding of what money actually meant. They remembered none of this, or they remembered it and simply didn't care. $200,000, and I was told to clean their bathrooms. I turned back to my desk and closed the folders one by one, stacking them neatly in the filing cabinet. My hands moved automatically, restoring order, putting pain back in its proper place. Then I reached for a different drawer, the locked one. My fingers found the small key in my pocket. I kept it with me always, and fit it into the lock. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside, a thick folder I hadn't shown anyone. Ever. I pulled it out and set it on my desk beside the calculator and the legal pad with its devastating total. This folder was labeled simply, Properties. I opened it and began to spread the contents across my desk. 6 property deeds, 6 addresses across Portland, 6 pieces of a puzzle they'd never known existed. And that's just what I gave them, I thought, looking at the deeds. Now let's count what I kept for myself. Morning light woke me, thin and gray, typical Portland June. I'd slept fitfully for maybe 4 hours, my mind churning through numbers and memories. The house was quiet. Through the wall I heard Elmer's alarm go off, then silence it. Footsteps, running water, low voices, their morning routine. I stayed in bed until I heard the front door close, the car engine start, the sound of them leaving for work. Only then did I rise and return to my desk. The property folder lay where I'd left it. Deeds spread across the surface like a hand of cards. 6 properties, 6 addresses across Portland that Thelma had driven past countless times without knowing. I picked up the first deed. Alberta Arts District. Purchased April 1995 for $85,000. I'd been 33, newly successful with Peterson and Associates, when I'd spotted the listing. The neighborhood was still rough then, artists and musicians filling warehouses, homeless encampments in empty lots. The real estate agent had warned me the area had challenges. I'd seen potential instead. Purchased it cash. Renovated it gradually. Rented it to a young couple who stayed 7 years. Now the neighborhood had coffee shops and galleries and restaurants with waiting lists. The property was worth approximately $650,000 according to the last appraisal. Monthly rental income after property management fees, $2,800. I set it aside and picked up the next deed. Pearl District, purchased September 1997 for $120,000. Back when the Pearl was still transitioning from warehouses to condos, when people questioned whether anyone would actually want to live in converted industrial buildings. I'd questioned nothing. I'd watched the market, seen the permits, understood the trajectory. Current value, $800,000. Monthly rental, $3,500. Selwood came next. Purchased March 2001 for $95,000. A classic Portland neighborhood, established but undervalued. I'd bought just before the housing boom really accelerated. Current value, $580,000. Monthly rental, $2,600. Memphis Tabor. Purchased November 2005 for $110,000. That one had been a foreclosure, a family overwhelmed by medical debt. I'd felt guilty buying their pain, but I'd also offered them a fair price in a terrible situation. Current value, $620,000. Monthly rental, $2,900. Mississippi Avenue. Purchased January 2008 for $88,000. The timing had been perfect, right at the recession's bottom, when everyone else was panicking and I was buying. The neighborhood had exploded since then with development and renovation. Current value, $595,000. Monthly rental, $2,700. Finally, St. John's. Purchased July 2015 for $78,000, the last purchase before I started considering retirement. The neighborhood was just beginning its upward swing. Current value, $520,000. Monthly rental, $2,400. I pulled my calculator closer and began adding. Property values first, $650,000, $800,000, $580,000, $620,000, $595,000, pocket $20,000. Total portfolio value, $465,000. Then monthly income, $2,800, $3,500, $2,600, $2,900, $2,700, $2,400. Total monthly rental income, $1,600. I stared at that number. $16,900 per month. From properties they didn't know existed. Managed through a property management company that handled everything. Repairs, tenant screening, rent collection. So I never had to mention rental income in casual conversation. They'd mocked my $200 Social Security payment. They had no idea I received over $16,000 in rental income alone. But I wasn't finished. I reached back into the locked drawer and pulled out a second folder. Thicker than the property folder, heavier with implications. Investment portfolio. Trust fund? Inside, quarterly statements from Vanguard, account summaries, documentation of decades of careful investing. Every profit from Peterson and Associates that I hadn't needed for living expenses had gone here. Index funds, mostly. Some bonds. A few tech stocks I'd bought during the boom and sold before the bust. Nothing fancy or risky, just steady, disciplined, long-term investing. I found the most recent statement. December 2024, 6 months ago. Account value, $10,507,328, $10.5 million. Give or take, depending on the market's mood. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the numbers spread across my desk. Property portfolio, $4.2 million. Investment trust, $10.5 million. Total net worth, approximately $14.7 million. Monthly income from rentals alone, $16,900. Annual investment returns at a conservative 4%, $420,000. Thelma thought I needed her house. I could retire tomorrow to anywhere in the world. Buy a condo in the Pearl District, probably in the building I already owned, and live out my days watching the river. Buy a villa in Tuscany, a beach house in California. Hell, I could buy this house outright, cash, and barely notice the expense. But that wouldn't teach her anything. I stood and walked to the window, my window in my small room in their house that I'd helped them purchase. Below, the old Toyota Camry sat in the driveway, 15 years old, 180,000 miles, running perfectly because I maintained it properly. I could afford a Mercedes, a Tesla. Whatever luxury vehicle represented success these days, I'd chosen the Toyota. Not because I couldn't afford better, but because new cars lost value the moment you drove them off the lot. Because spending money to impress people was the surest sign you didn't actually have money. Because I'd learned early that looking rich and being rich were completely different games. I'd thought living modestly would teach Thelma these lessons. I'd thought she'd see that happiness didn't come from spending, but from security, from knowing you were prepared for anything. Instead, she'd learned to mock frugality and worship waste. She'd learned nothing except that Daddy would always write another check. Well, time for a different lesson. I returned to the desk and carefully placed all the property deeds back in the locked drawer. The investment statements followed. I kept only one document out, the most recent trust fund summary showing the $10.5 million balance. I set it beside yesterday's calculation, the $217,000 I'd given them over the years. The contrast was stark. What I'd given them would barely make a dent in what I'd built for myself. They'd offered me a choice, serve them or leave. They'd thought those were my only options. They didn't realize I had a third option, and a fourth, and a fifth. I had the kind of options that only money, real money, could buy. My phone sat on the desk beside the documents. I picked it up, looked at it, set it down. Not yet. First, I needed to think through the strategy. Accountants didn't make impulsive moves. They planned, they calculated. They found the most efficient path to the desired outcome. And the desired outcome was simple. They needed to learn what I'd always known. Money wasn't about what you displayed, it was about what you controlled. And right now, I controlled far more than they could imagine. I locked the drawer again, slipped the key back into my pocket, and stood at the window watching morning traffic build on the street below. Somewhere out there, Thelma was in her office, probably complaining to coworkers about her burden of an elderly father. Somewhere, Elmer was at his desk, feeling smug about putting the old man in his place. Let them feel smug? Let them think they'd won. The best victories came when your opponent didn't realize they were already defeated. I spent the next 2 days researching attorneys. Not randomly, methodically, the way I'd approached everything in my accounting career. I needed someone who specialized in real estate disputes, particularly co-ownership conflicts and partition actions. Someone experienced but not so prominent, they'd be prohibitively expensive or unavailable for weeks. Robert Chen's name appeared in multiple searches. 15 years of practice, focused on property law, solid reviews emphasizing his direct communication style. I called his office on the morning of June 18th and scheduled a consultation for the following day. That evening, I prepared my materials. The wire transfer receipt showing the $75,000 payment, the property deed listing me as co-owner, bank statements, a typed timeline of our relationship, the major financial contributions, the dinner confrontation, Elmer's ultimatum. I organized everything in a folder, tabbed and annotated the way I'd have prepared documents for a client audit. Chen's office occupied the 9th floor of a glass building on Southwest Morrison. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in slacks and a pressed button-down shirt. Not the clothes of a man who needed charity, the clothes of someone conducting business. The reception area smelled of leather and coffee. Legal books lined one wall, framed diplomas and certificates covered another. A young woman directed me to a conference room where Chen waited, reviewing something on his laptop. He stood to shake my hand, mid-40s, sharp suit, firm grip. "Mr. Peterson, please sit. Tell me about your situation." I laid out the folder and began methodically. The dinner, the mockery of my Social Security income, the ultimatum to serve them or leave, their dismissal when I reminded them about the down payment. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he reached for the property deed. His pen tapped the page where my name appeared. "You're listed as co-owner with 50% interest, not as a lender, not with any notation about repayment terms. As an owner, that's correct. Walk me through the initial transaction. Was there a promissory note? A loan agreement? Anything in writing about repayment? Nothing. It was family help. I wanted them to qualify for the mortgage, so I contributed half the down payment. I assumed we all understood. That meant I had a permanent stake in the property. Chen nodded slowly. Without written loan terms, the $75,000 is legally a gift. You can't sue for repayment. He tapped the deed again. But this changes everything. You're not a creditor seeking repayment. You're an owner seeking to dissolve co-ownership. That's a completely different legal mechanism. What are my options? Partition action. Under Oregon law, when co-owners can't agree on property disposition, any owner can petition the court to force either a buyout or a sale. You have absolute legal right to demand they purchase your 50% share at fair market value, or the court orders the property sold and the proceeds divided. He pulled up something on his laptop, recent comparable sales in their neighborhood. Based on current market conditions, I'd estimate the property value at around $470,000. Your 50% interest would be approximately $235,000. The number settled into my chest. I'd paid $75,000 12 years ago, now worth $235,000. They'd lived there free of any rent payment to me, building equity on my investment, and told me to clean their bathrooms. We start with a demand letter, Chen continued. Certified mail, return receipt. Give them 30 days to either buy you out for market value or agree to list the property. If they refuse or ignore it, we file the partition action. Most cases settle once defendants realize they can't win. How strong is the case? Very strong. Your name is clearly on the deed with 50% ownership. No judge will let them keep 100% of a property you half own. The only question is whether they buy you out or we force a sale. I sat back, processing. This was real. This was possible. I wasn't trapped. Chen's expression shifted slightly. Is there anything else I should know? Any other leverage or complications? I hesitated, then spoke carefully. My son-in-law does cash work on the side, construction help, handyman services. I'd estimate $15,000 or more annually. I don't believe any of it appears on their tax returns. Chen's eyebrows rose fractionally. He set down his pen and leaned back. That would be tax fraud. Substantial unreported income invites audits, penalties, potentially criminal charges. He paused. I should be clear. I can't advise you on IRS matters. That's not my specialty. But there are avenues for reporting suspected fraud. Anonymous tip lines. It's a separate track from the property dispute. Is the property claim sufficient? The property claim will definitely get their attention. It's clean, legally straightforward, morally defensible. You're simply asking for what you own. The tax issue is more aggressive. Nuclear option territory. Whether you pursue that is a personal decision based on how far you want to push this. I looked at the deed on the table, my name in printed letters beside Thelma's. Let's start with the demand letter. 30 days to respond. And if they can't come up with the money, then we file for partition and let the court handle it. Chen pulled out a retainer agreement. My fee for the demand letter and initial filing if needed is $3,500. If it goes to full litigation, we'll discuss additional costs. But honestly, most of these cases settle. People realize quickly they can't afford to fight when the law is clear. I pulled my checkbook from my briefcase and wrote the check without hesitation. $3,500. Barely a rounding error in my investment accounts. For them, it would be a financial disaster. I'll have the demand letter drafted and sent via certified mail by tomorrow. Chen said, You should know, once this goes out, there's no taking it back quietly. Your relationship with your daughter will change permanently. It already has. I signed the retainer agreement and slid it across the table. They made that decision at dinner. I'm just making mine now. Chen gathered the documents, slipping them into a file folder with my name on the tab. I'll call you once the letter has been delivered. After that, we wait for their response. I shook his hand and left the office building into Portland's overcast afternoon. In my briefcase, a copy of the property deed, the retainer agreement, Chen's business card. In my chest, something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. The next day, I moved into one of my Pearl District rental units. A tenant had just moved out, and I'd planned to list it again in July. Instead, I claimed it for myself. 9th floor, river view, modern appliances, everything Thelma's house wasn't. I brought 2 suitcases of clothes in my filing cabinet, left everything else in that small bedroom. Chen's text arrived on June 21st. Letter sent via certified mail. Delivery confirmation should arrive Monday or Tuesday. I set my phone down and looked out at the Willamette River below, the bridges stretching across dark water. Somewhere across town, certified mail was making its way to their house. Let them sign for it. Let them open it. Let them learn what powerless actually looked like. The call came on the evening of June 24th. I was sitting in my new apartment with coffee and a book when my phone buzzed. Thelma's name on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Thelma? What is this?" Her voice came out high and tight. "Why did we just get a letter from a lawyer? You're suing us?" "I'm not suing. Not yet. The letter is a formal notice that I'm exercising my rights as a co-owner of the property." "Your rights?" She was breathing hard. "That money was a gift. You said it was to help us start our life together." I kept my voice level. "If it was a gift, why is my name on the deed as a 50% owner? Gifts don't come with ownership stakes, Thelma. You can't just... We don't have $200,000? Where are we supposed to get that kind of money?" "That's not my problem. You have 30 days to figure it out. Buy me out at market value, or we sell the house and split the proceeds. Those are your options." The phone muffled. She was covering it, talking to someone. Elmer, probably. When she came back, her voice had shifted from panic to accusation. "This is because of dinner. Because we hurt your feelings. You're being petty and vindictive. You told me to leave or become your servant. I'm leaving, but I'm taking what belongs to me." "Dad, please!" Now she was crying. Real tears or strategic ones, I couldn't tell anymore. "We can talk about this. Come home. We'll figure something out." "Grover!" Elmer's voice sharp and angry. He'd grabbed the phone. "This is absurd. You're really going to do this? Take us to court over money you gave us years ago?" "I'm exercising legal rights. My name is on that deed. I own half that house. You made it very clear I'm not welcome there, so I'm cashing out my investment. We'll fight this. We'll get our own lawyer. We'll prove that money was a gift. You're welcome to hire an attorney. Mine says we have a strong case. But I should mention, legal battles are expensive. Very expensive. How much do you have saved for attorney fees?" Silence. Then, "Are you threatening us?" "I'm stating facts. You asked about my financial situation at dinner. You laughed at my Social Security check. Now you know the truth. I have resources. The question is, do you?" More muffled conversation. I heard Thelma's voice in the background, sharp with fear. Elmer came back on the line. "If you do this, you're dead to us. You understand that? You'll never see your daughter again." Something cold settled in my stomach, but my voice stayed steady. "I haven't really seen her for years anyway. Just someone who looks like her but treats me like hired help. Goodbye, Elmer." I ended the call before he could respond. The phone buzzed again immediately, Thelma calling back. I declined it. It rang again. Declined. Again. I turned off the ringer and set the phone face down on the table. Outside my window, Portland's evening lights were beginning to glow. The river reflected them in wavering lines. I picked up my coffee, cold now, and carried it to the kitchen to pour out. My phone screen lit up silently. A text from Thelma. "Dad, please, just talk to us. We can work this out." Another. "You're really going to make us homeless?" Another. "After everything we've done for you." I left the phone on the counter and returned to the window. 24 floors below, people moved along the waterfront paths. Cars crossed the bridges. The city continued its evening routine, indifferent to family implosions. After everything they'd done for me. The phrase sat in my mind like a stone. They'd given me a room. They'd let me live in a house I half owned. They'd graciously allowed me to exist in their space while they built equity on my $75,000. And when I could no longer contribute financially, when I became what they perceived as a burden, they'd offered servitude or exile. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it. Across town, I imagined them in their house, my house, frantically Googling partition actions, reading legal forums, discovering that everything Chen's letter claimed was true, that any co-owner could force a buyout or sale, that they couldn't stop it without my agreement. I imagined them pulling out their bank statements, $12,000 in savings maybe, some retirement accounts they couldn't easily access, a mortgage with 18 years remaining, credit cards probably carrying balances from their comfortable lifestyle. $235,000. They couldn't raise it, not in 30 days, maybe not ever. They'd have to sell, or convince a bank to refinance with a massive cash out, which would require my signature, which I wouldn't give. They were trapped in a box of their own making, built from assumptions about my weakness and their strength. The phone stopped buzzing. Minutes passed in silence. Then a final text from Elmer. "You'll regret this, old man." I picked up my phone and typed a response. "The 30-day clock is ticking. Make your decision." Then I blocked both their numbers. I walked to my bedroom, my actual bedroom, not a marginal space in someone else's house, and opened the closet, empty except for the clothes I'd brought. In Thelma's house, my belongings still sat in that small room. I'd need to retrieve them eventually, but not yet. Let them sit there, a reminder of what they'd lost. I returned to the living room and finally opened my laptop, pulled up my bank accounts, my investment portfolios, the spreadsheets tracking my properties and their values, numbers glowing on the screen in the darkening room. $14.7 million, more than enough to see this through to whatever end it reached. They'd asked me about my financial situation, mocked my Social Security check, treated me like a beggar grateful for scraps from their table. The first move was always going to be the hardest, for them. I closed the laptop and stood at the window again, watching the city lights multiply in the growing darkness. 30 days. They had 30 days to find money they didn't have, to solve a problem with no good solution, to face consequences they'd never imagined. And I had 30 days to wait. They tried the banks first. Of course they did. Legitimate money from legitimate sources. I watched from my Pearl District windows as June turned to July, imagining their visits to loan officers, their carefully prepared explanations, their growing desperation with each rejection. I knew they'd fail before they started. Thelma called her bank on June 27th, made an appointment for the 28th. I didn't know this firsthand, obviously, but Chen had ways of learning things. Portland's legal community talks. Their chief attorney would eventually tell us the story in court filings, and some details I simply extrapolated from knowing them, from understanding their limited options and dwindling time. They needed $235,000. Their savings account held maybe $12,000. Their first stop, the credit union where they'd gotten their mortgage 12 years ago. The loan officer reviewed their application with sympathetic professionalism. Combined annual income, approximately $120,000. Current mortgage balance, $280,000. 2 car loans, credit card debt. The officer's calculator clicked through the numbers. Debt-to-income ratio, 43%. Most lenders capped approval at 36%. "I understand this is urgent," she told them, "but with your current debt level and credit history, we can't approve a loan of this size." Elmer tried to argue. "We have equity in the house, almost $200,000 in equity. To access that equity, you'd need all co-owners to agree to a refinance. And even then, your income doesn't support the increased mortgage payment." They left with nothing but a pamphlet about debt consolidation services. Over the next week, they tried 3 more banks. Same story, different offices. Their credit scores, mid-600s, weren't terrible, but weren't good enough for an unsecured $235,000 loan. The missed car payments from 5 years ago still showed on their credit reports, red flags that whispered unreliable. Meanwhile, I settled into my apartment, the spacious one-bedroom I'd kept vacant between tenants, planning to relist it in July. Instead, I moved in the day after meeting with Chen. 9th floor, corner unit, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette. The building was mine, purchased in 1997 for $120,000, now worth $800,000. This particular unit rented for $2,800 monthly when occupied. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, hung my clothes in a real closet, not a narrow alcove, set up my desk facing the river, made coffee each morning using the espresso machine I'd bought years ago, but never used in that cramped room at their house. For the first time in 12 years, I woke without tension. No footsteps overhead, no muffled arguments through walls, no sense of being tolerated rather than welcomed. This was what freedom tasted like, expensive coffee and morning silence. While I established my routines, they scrambled. Thelma started calling friends around July 3rd. I imagined those conversations, her forced cheerfulness. It's a family situation, kind of complicated, but we need to borrow some money temporarily, just until we can refinance. Amounts varied: $50,000 from her closest friend, $30,000 from a college roommate she hadn't spoken to in 5 years, $20,000 from a couple they'd vacationed with last summer. Each conversation ended the same way: awkward silence, promises to think about it, eventually polite declines. One friend, I learned this detail later, said bluntly, "If banks won't loan you money, why would I?" By July 5th, they'd exhausted their network. No one had $50,000 liquid, and even close friends don't hand over 5 figures without collateral or absolute certainty of repayment. They sense desperation, and desperation makes people uncomfortable. Elmer found a private lending company that specialized in high-risk loans. They'd loan $50,000 at 18% annual interest with a lien on the house. The monthly payment would be crushing, and $50,000 wasn't nearly enough anyway. When he suggested it, Thelma refused. "That's insane. We'd be bankrupt within a year." Their fights escalated. I didn't witness these, but I knew they were happening. Stress like that doesn't exist in silence. She blamed him for his disrespect at dinner. He blamed her for laughing at my Social Security income. She blamed him for not saving money. He blamed her for having a difficult father. They stopped sleeping in the same room. Elmer started coming home late, stopping at bars. Thelma cried herself to sleep most nights, or so I imagined based on her red eyes during later encounters. The house they were fighting to keep had become a prison built from their own contempt. On July 7th, I made my decision about the tax fraud. I'd thought about it since Chen first mentioned the option. Elmer's cash work wasn't a secret. He'd bragged about it at a family dinner the previous year. "Beating the tax man," he'd called it, laughing about the handyman jobs he did on weekends, the cash payments that never appeared on tax returns. I'd said nothing at the time, just filed the information away. Now I retrieved it. The IRS website had a form for reporting suspected tax fraud. Form 3949A, Information Referral. I downloaded it, filled it out methodically. Name: Elmer Hayes. Address: estimated unreported income: $15,000 annually for the past 3 years, possibly longer. Nature of income: cash payments for construction and handyman services. Basis for knowledge: personal observation over multiple years. I printed it, signed it anonymously, addressed an envelope with no return address, drove downtown to a postal box 2 miles from my building, not the one in my lobby, and dropped it in. The metallic clang of the mail slot closing had a finality to it. The second strike deployed. Now I just had to wait for it to land. By July 10th, they'd been searching for 2 weeks. They had 20 days left on Chen's 30-day deadline. Every legitimate option had been exhausted. Every bank had said no. Every friend had declined. The predatory lender wanted terms they couldn't afford. They sat at their dining table, the same table where they'd mocked my retirement dinner, surrounded by rejection letters, loan applications, credit card statements. A calendar on the wall showed days crossed off in red marker. July 24th circled deadline. I stood at my window that evening, coffee in hand, watching the city lights reflect off the river. Somewhere across town they were panicking. Here I was calm. The first 2 weeks had been hard for them. The next 2 would be worse. The IRS letter arrived on July 11th. Certified mail, return receipt required. Elmer signed for it mid-morning, saw the return address, Internal Revenue Service, and his stomach dropped. You don't get certified letters from the IRS unless something's wrong. He tore it open. Thelma read over his shoulder. "You have been selected for examination of your federal tax returns for years 2022, 2023, and 2024. Specifically, we are investigating potential unreported income from cash payments received for services rendered. You are required to provide documentation of all income sources, including bank statements, receipts, client lists, and proof of reported income. Failure to comply will result in penalties and potential criminal charges." The audit appointment was scheduled for August 8th. 3 weeks away. The letter requested boxes of documentation they didn't have because the income had never been reported in the first place. Elmer set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "This is him. Your father did this. He reported me." Thelma stared at the letter. You don't know that. Who else would know? Who else would care? His voice rose. He's trying to destroy us. Maybe we destroyed ourselves. Her voice was flat, exhausted. They spent the afternoon Googling IRS audit penalties. Every search result made things worse. Unreported income penalties, 20–40% of the unreported amount, plus the taxes owed, plus interest. If Elmer had failed to report $15,000 annually for 3 years, $45,000 total, the taxes owed would be around $8,500. Penalties and interest, another $3,500 minimum. Total bill, approximately $12,000. Money they absolutely did not have, on top of the $235,000 they also did not have. Elmer slammed his laptop shut. We're being attacked from 2 directions. Because we earned it, Thelma said quietly. We earned every bit of this. On July 14th, Thelma decided to visit her father. She couldn't stand waiting anymore. Couldn't stand the silence. She needed to see him to try one last time to make him understand. She found his address on Chen's letterhead, the return address on the demand letter, Southwest Naito Parkway, Pearl District. She drove there that afternoon, parked on the street, and looked up at the building. Glass and steel, modern architecture, the kind of building with a doorman and controlled access. She checked the address again. This couldn't be right. Her father wouldn't live here. He couldn't afford to live here. But the intercom directory listed G. Peterson for Unit 904. She pressed the button. Hello? His voice calm and unsurprised. Dad, it's me. Can I come up? A pause. Then, 9th floor. The elevator was mirrored stainless steel, smooth and silent. It opened directly into his apartment. Upscale buildings did that. 1 apartment per floor in the corners. She stepped out and stopped. The space was enormous. Open floor plan, kitchen with granite counters and expensive appliances, living area with leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows spanning 2 walls. The view stretched across the river to the bridges and mountains beyond. Her father stood by the kitchen counter, calmly preparing coffee. How? She couldn't finish the question. How long have I lived here? He poured water into an espresso machine. I moved in after our last conversation. It's one of my properties. One of your properties? I own the building. He pressed a button. The machine hissed. I own 6 buildings across Portland, actually. This is just one of them. She walked to the window, needing something to ground herself. Below, people moved along the waterfront paths. The city continued its routines, indifferent to her world-shattering. You said, at dinner, you said Social Security was $1,200 a month. You let us think. I told you my Social Security amount. That's accurate. He poured espresso into a small cup. I never said it was my only income. You assumed I was poor because I lived modestly. That assumption was yours, not mine. But why? Why live in that tiny room if you could afford... She gestured at the apartment. He handed her the espresso. She took it automatically, didn't drink. I lived modestly to set an example. I wanted you to learn that wealth isn't about spending. It's about building security. Your mother and I built something solid over 35 years. We invested carefully. We didn't confuse looking rich with being rich. He sat in a leather chair, perfectly comfortable in his space. I thought you'd learn from watching. I was wrong. Dad, please. Her voice cracked. We can't pay the $200,000, and now the IRS. Actions have consequences. Elmer chose to evade taxes. That's on him. Did you report him? He met her eyes. Would it matter? The unreported income exists. Whether someone reported it or he got randomly audited, the result is the same. He broke the law. We're going to lose everything. You'll have your half of the proceeds, about $235,000. You can buy a smaller place or rent. Many people live on less. I'm your daughter. You're my daughter who told me my retirement income was a joke, who laughed when I mentioned $1,200. His voice stayed level, not angry, just factual. You had a choice, Thelma. Respect or contempt. You chose contempt. She started crying. Real tears this time, not strategic ones. I'm sorry. We were wrong. We were cruel. But don't do this. Forgiveness requires remorse before consequences, not after. He sipped his espresso. You're sorry now because you're cornered, not because you understood what you did wrong. She set down her untouched coffee and left, unable to find words that would change anything. In her car, parked outside the building, she called Elmer. He's rich. He's been rich this whole time. We never knew. He planned all of this. Elmer's response was pure rage. Then we fight. We get our own lawyer. We prove that money was a gift. On July 18th, they found an attorney willing to take their case. He worked out of a strip mall office, charged $500 for a consultation, looked exhausted juggling too many cases, but he was what they could afford. He reviewed their documents. The wire transfer labeled gift. The property deed listing Grover as 50% owner. The deed is clear. He's an owner. The gift issue doesn't matter because he's not asking for loan repayment. He's exercising ownership rights. The attorney leaned back in his worn chair. You'd have to prove that putting his name on the deed was a mistake, which would be nearly impossible without evidence of fraud or duress. Can we argue he abandoned the ownership? Elmer asked. He hasn't contributed to mortgage payments for 12 years. That's not abandonment legally. Non-contribution to mortgage doesn't negate titled ownership. This will cost you several $1,000s and you'll likely lose. But if you want to file a response. They paid him $2,000 they didn't have, maxed another credit card. He drafted a response arguing undue hardship, claiming the $75,000 was a gift, suggesting Grover had abandoned his interest through non-payment. It was weak, and they knew it. They filed the response on July 23rd, one day before the deadline expired. Chen called me that evening. They've hired an attorney, filed a response. It's exactly what I expected. Lots of appeals to fairness, not much law. We can proceed with the partition action. I stood at my window, watching evening light fade over the river. File it. You're certain? Once we file, this becomes public record. Court proceedings, hearings, eventually a forced sale or buyout. I'm certain. I'll prepare the filing tomorrow. We should have a court date within 6 weeks. I hung up and poured myself a whiskey. Good single malt I'd been saving. Raised the glass toward the city lights where they sat in their house, their response filed, thinking they'd bought themselves time or leverage. They'd bought themselves nothing but delay. The partition lawsuit would proceed. The IRS audit would proceed. And they would learn what powerless actually meant. The second strike had landed. Now came the endgame. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Multnomah County Circuit Court, 4th floor, Judge Patricia Morrison presiding, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the SIL of Oregon mounted behind the bench. Thelma and Elmer sat with their attorney at one table, Chen and I at another. When Judge Morrison entered, we all stood. She was perhaps 50 efficient movements, reading glasses on a chain. Please be seated. Case number 25, the CV 8847, Peterson versus Hayes and Morrison. This is a petition for partition of real property. Chen presented our case clearly. I was a titled owner seeking partition under Oregon Revised Statutes, Section 105-405. The property deed, admitted as evidence, showed my name with 50% ownership interest. The property, a single-family home, couldn't be physically divided. Therefore, judicial sale was the appropriate remedy. Their attorney tried, argued the original $75,000 was a gift, that I'd abandoned my interest through 12 years of non-contribution to the mortgage. His voice carried that particular strain of knowing your argument is weak, but being professionally obligated to make it anyway. Judge Morrison barely glanced up from the documents. The deed is clear. Mr. Peterson is a titled owner. Oregon law does not require co-owners to contribute to another owner's debts. Non-payment of the mortgage is irrelevant to ownership status. She made a note. The defendants have 45 days to purchase the plaintiff's 50% interest at fair market value, as determined by court-ordered appraisal. Failure to do so will result in judicial sale with proceeds divided according to ownership interest. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Final. Official. Absolute. I saw Thelma flinch at the sound. Outside the courthouse, their attorney mumbled condolences. I'm sorry. I told you the legal position was weak. They stood on the courthouse steps, midday sun harsh on their faces. Thelma was crying. Elmer's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. I walked past them to where Chen waited. The appraisal will confirm value around $470, Chen said. Your share, $235,000. They have until September 10th to pay, or the house goes to auction. Thank you, Robert. I drove back to Pearl District and made coffee, stood at my window watching the river. Somewhere across town, they were realizing 45 days was just as impossible as 30 had been. The next week, Elmer found a lending company. Not a bank, a hard money lender specializing in desperate situations. They offered $50,000 at 18% annual interest, secured by second mortgage. I learned this later, when the documents became part of the court record. Elmer signed. The money barely covered the IRS bill and bought them a few months of breathing room. It solved nothing. By mid-August, they'd listed the house. I drove by once, saw the realtor's sign planted in the lawn I'd watched Elmer neglect for years. The market had softened. Late summer, families settled for the school year. Showings happened, but offers came in low. Buyers knew they were motivated sellers. The court case was public record. Their realtor called me once, professionally. "Mr. Peterson, the property is listed at $470. We have an offer at $435. Would you consider accepting?" "That's their decision," I said. "I'm simply waiting for my share of whatever they get." Meanwhile, their marriage disintegrated. I didn't witness the fights, but Chen's paralegal filed updates. Thelma moved out August 15th, filed for divorce 3 days later. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and referenced the ongoing property dispute. Elmer lost his job August 18th. His manager had noticed the distraction, the court appearances, the declining performance. In an at-will employment state, they didn't need much reason. He was simply let go. I sat in my apartment that evening, Chen's call fresh in my mind with these updates. I felt no triumph, just the cold satisfaction of watching natural consequences unfold. They'd built this collapse themselves, brick by brick, starting with that dinner where they'd laughed at my retirement. August 20th, their realtor called again. "We have an offer at $455. I recommend they accept. The market isn't improving, and they're running out of time." They accepted. The mathematics were brutal. Sale price $400,000, minus realtor fees of $27,000, minus mortgage payoff of $280,000, minus Elmer's predatory loan of $50,000. Total remaining $98,000. Split 50-50 per court order, $49,000 each. 12 years of mortgage payments, 12 years of equity building. They'd walk away with $49,000, less than they'd put down. That evening, I imagined Thelma alone in her friend's apartment, doing the same calculations I'd done, realizing they'd lost everything they'd built, not because I'd stolen it, because they'd squandered the foundation I'd given them, and then treated me with contempt when I could no longer contribute. She must have been thinking about that dinner, that moment when her laughter had started this cascade, the ultimatum Elmer had delivered so confidently: be our servant or leave. I'd left, and I'd taken what belonged to me. I poured whiskey that night, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. The legal system had worked. Justice had been served. They'd learned what powerless actually meant. But I felt older than 63, tired, vindicated but not victorious. The next morning, my phone rang. Thelma's number, one I hadn't blocked because I'd known this call would eventually come. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Thelma?" "Dad." Her voice was small, fragile. "Can I come see you? Just me, not Elmer. I need to talk." I stood at my window, coffee in hand, watching morning light on the river. Behind me, my apartment was quiet. Ahead, a decision: allow this conversation or refuse it. "Tomorrow afternoon," I said. 2:00. She arrived exactly on time. She stood in my doorway looking diminished, no makeup covering the circles under her eyes, simple jeans and a sweater, hands empty except for her car keys. Not the entitled woman who'd laughed at my Social Security check. Someone else, someone humbler. "Come in," I said. She walked to the window first, as if needing to ground herself in the view before turning to face me. When she did, her eyes were red but dry. I don't know how to start, except to say I'm sorry. She sat on the edge of my couch, back straight, hands folded, for the dinner, for laughing, for treating you like you were disposable, for years of taking your help without gratitude, without ever asking what it cost you. I sat in the chair across from her, said nothing, let her continue. "Elmer told you to be a servant, and I didn't stop him. I agreed with him. I treated you like a burden instead of my father." Her voice caught. For years I took your money. The down payment, the wedding, paying our debts, Timothy's care. I took and never said thank you. Never asked what you sacrificed to give us those things. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You tried to teach me about money, about respect, about values. You lived modestly to show me something, and I thought you were just poor. I never understood you were wise. I wasn't a good daughter, Dad. I used you as a wallet. I didn't love you the way you deserved. The tears came then, but she didn't look away. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect help. I just needed you to know I finally understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Outside, Portland traffic hummed. Inside, the distance of months compressed into this single conversation. I didn't do this to destroy you, Thelma. I did it to teach you. There's a difference. I leaned forward. Punishment is about making someone suffer. Teaching is about showing consequences so people can learn and grow. You've learned. That's what I needed to see. I lost everything. You lost things. That's different from everything. You still have your health, your job, your ability to rebuild. You lost material possessions and a toxic marriage. Sometimes that's not loss. That's liberation. She nodded slowly. Why did you let us think you were poor? I wanted you to see that a rich life doesn't come from spending. It comes from having choices, security, freedom. I thought if you watched me live modestly but contentedly, you'd learn. But you didn't see contentment. You just saw modesty and thought it meant weakness. I stood, walked to my desk, retrieved a document I'd prepared days ago, anticipating this conversation, slid it across the coffee table. The house is selling. Your half of the proceeds is about $49,000. That's not enough to start over comfortably. I tapped the paper. I'm offering to buy out your entire share, yours and Elmer's both, for $200,000. It's less than the court valuation, but more than you'll get from the sale after expenses. It'll let you settle your debts, pay the IRS, have a cushion to start fresh. She stared at the document like it might vanish. Why would you do that? After everything? Because you're here. Because you apologized. Because you're my daughter, and I'm not interested in destroying you. I'm interested in you becoming someone worth knowing. I don't deserve this. Probably not. But mercy isn't about deserving. It's about possibility. You came here, took responsibility, showed genuine remorse. That's worth something. I sat back. This isn't a gift, Thelma. This is closure. You take this money, settle your affairs, and build a life on your own terms. Not on my money. Not on anyone's money. Your own earnings, your own choices. She picked up the document with shaking hands. Read it twice. What about Elmer? His half of the $200,000 is his to use as he needs. Paying the IRS, settling his debts, starting over. That's between him and his choices. But you, I paused, choosing words carefully. You need to leave that marriage. Not because I demand it, but because staying won't let either of you grow. He's not going to change. You are. I already filed for divorce. Good. She set down the paper. Did you report him to the IRS? I met her eyes. If Elmer settles honestly, pays what he owes, I won't pursue anything further. No criminal complaints. But he needs to make it right. I'll tell him. We sat in silence. Not uncomfortable, just complete. She'd said what she needed to say. I'd offered what I was willing to give. The transaction was simple, but the reconciliation would take years. Can we? She started, stopped, tried again. Do you think someday we could have a real relationship? Father and daughter? Not creditor and debtor? We're having a conversation right now. That's a start. Real relationships take time to rebuild. But yes, someday, if you keep growing. She stood to leave. I walked her to the door. When I offered my hand, she took it. A handshake, not a hug. Formal respect between two people finding new footing. It was enough. 1 week later, we met at a coffee shop in Pearl District. She'd moved into a small apartment in Montevilla. Affordable, manageable on her salary. She showed me a budget spreadsheet on her phone, proud as a child showing good grades. Income here, expenses here, savings goals here. I can actually make this work. That's more valuable than a big house you can't afford, I said. I understand that now. We talked about ordinary things, her new apartment, my plans to travel. Europe, maybe. use some of that money I'd been saving. She asked questions about my properties, genuinely curious. I answered, not hiding but not boasting. When we parted, she hugged me briefly. Thank you, Dad, for teaching me, even though it hurt. The best lessons usually do. I drove home to the house that had caused all this conflict. I'd purchased it completely with the $200,000, remodeled one room as an office, settled into the space. It wasn't a trophy, just my home now, finally, fully mine. That evening I sat on the back deck with coffee, looking at the garden that needed tending. The house was quiet. No tension, no disrespect, no sense of being merely tolerated, just peace. I thought about the journey, that dinner in June, the mockery, the ultimatum, the long months of legal maneuvering and watching them collapse under the weight of their own choices. I'd reclaimed my dignity. That was the point. Not the money, not the house, not even the lesson, though that mattered too. At 63, I'd learned something myself. It's never too late to stand up, to demand respect, to refuse to be diminished. I'd spent most of my life building security for others. Now I was building it for myself, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. The most important lesson I'd taught wasn't about money or property. It was about dignity. And at 63, I'd finally reclaimed mine. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.